You ever get that strange feeling that someone's watching you, but you can't prove it? That was me standing in my backyard, coffee in hand, watching a little drone hover above my tomato patch. Not a delivery drone, not a kid's toy. This one had a sticker on the side that said HOA. At first I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe a realtor? Maybe a lost drone? But then it turned and just hovered there, right over my garden beds. Like it was inspecting me. I could almost feel someone on the other end of that camera, judging the color of my fence, the height of my coop, maybe even counting how many chickens I had. The funny part? I wasn't breaking a single law. This was my land, my quiet little farm tucked at the edge of suburbia. But in a neighborhood ruled by an HOA, ownership doesn't always mean control. That morning, I realized something most people never think about, on that peace and quiet can disappear the moment someone decides your way of living doesn't fit their rules, and that's how my fight with the HOA started, not over money or noise or fences, but over a few tomato plants and the right to live free on my own land. Because sometimes, the biggest battles start with the smallest seeds. But let me start at the beginning. Before we dive in, let me know where you're listening from today. It was one of those calm mornings that make you forget the world is full of rules and paperwork. The sun was warm, the soil smelled like rain and tomato leaves, and I was on my knees checking the irrigation line behind my cedar fence. Just another quiet start to the day. Then I heard it, that faint, steady buzzing. At first I thought it was a wasp, but when I looked up, my stomach dropped. There it was, a little black drone hovering right above my garden. It wasn't some kid's toy or a delivery drone either. On the side, clear as day, was a white sticker with 3 bold letters, HOA. I froze. I'd seen them use drones before to inspect roof colors, count sheds, even check if fences matched neighborhood standards, but this time it was over my garden beds. I wiped the dirt off my hands and just stood there, staring at the thing as it hovered, tilted, then slowly panned its camera toward my coop. 4 hens clucked lazily in the corner, completely unaware they were now part of a community inspection. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize your privacy isn't really yours? That was it. A mix of anger and disbelief washed over me. I had bought this place specifically to be left alone, a few acres just outside city limits, far enough from the HOA to breathe. Or at least I thought so. The drone buzzed closer, maybe 10 feet above me now. I could see my reflection in its lens. I waved, half sarcastic, half hoping whoever was controlling it would get the message. Then it zipped straight up and vanished beyond the rooftops. I stood there for a while trying to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. But deep down I knew better. Anything with that logo meant trouble. Because in HOA land, every inspection ends with a letter. 2 days later, the letter showed up in my mailbox. White envelope. Fancy letterhead. The kind of thing that already feels like a threat before you even open it. It read, Notice of violation. Agricultural activity not permitted in residential zones. Fine, $500. 10 days to cease all commercial operations. Commercial operations. I actually laughed out loud reading that. My so-called operation was 6 raised beds, 4 hens, and a rain barrel system I'd built from leftover PVC pipe. There wasn't a single dollar involved, unless you count the eggs I sometimes traded with my neighbor for coffee. Still, the letter stung. It wasn't just the fine. It was the way they twisted something pure and simple, growing food, taking care of the land, into a violation. It felt personal, like they weren't just rejecting my garden but the whole idea of living differently. I pinned that notice to the fridge. Not out of pride, but as a reminder, this was the line. I could either fold and comply or finally push back. Because it wasn't just about vegetables anymore, it was about whether I actually owned the ground I worked on. That night, I sat down with a cup of coffee and decided to dig deeper. If they wanted to quote rules, I was going to learn every single one of them. 3 hours later, my kitchen table looked like a war zone of coffee cups, old maps, and county ordinance printouts. I didn't really know what I was looking for. Maybe a loophole, maybe just proof I wasn't crazy. But then I found something that changed everything. According to the official survey, the HOA's jurisdiction ended exactly 15 feet past the rear property stake. My fence? 25 feet in, which meant 10 feet of land behind it, the same strip where my back row of vegetables grew, wasn't under their control at all. That was my first small victory. But then came the twist that turned this into a full-blown standoff. That same strip of land had been used by the HOA for their community walking trail. The same one where people jogged every morning. I stared at the map for a long minute, realizing what that meant. All those joggers? Technically trespassing. The HOA had been using my land for years, the very people fining me for unauthorized activity. I couldn't help but laugh. The irony was too perfect. They'd accused me of breaking rules while literally walking on my property without permission. I didn't act right away, though. I wanted to see how far they'd go. Day 10 came and went with no word. Then, on the morning of day 11, I saw a familiar silver Lexus crawling up my driveway. Out stepped Cheryl Donnelly, the HOA president, 60 years old, perfectly pressed blouse, clipboard clutched like a sword. 2 board members trailed behind her, equally stiff. Like soldiers reporting for duty, I wiped my hands on my jeans and met her halfway. "Morning," I said. She smiled that thin, practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Harris, you've ignored multiple notices regarding your illegal agricultural activity." "You mean my garden?" I asked. "Your farm," she corrected, emphasizing the word like it was dirty. "We have photographic evidence." "Oh, you mean the drone?" I couldn't help but grin. "Yeah, saw your little spy toy, cute." Her jaw tightened. "The drones are for community inspection purposes." "Over private property?" I raised an eyebrow. "Didn't realize we lived in a surveillance zone." That one hit. I saw her flinch, just slightly, Palm, before she recovered. "You consented to inspections when you joined the association." "Actually," I said, pulling the folded deed from my back pocket, "I didn't join. The HOA was formed after I bought this land. I'm not a member, just subject to easements." For the first time since she arrived, Cheryl didn't have a response. Her lips pressed into a hard line as she stared at the paper, then at me. "Well," she said finally, "we'll see what our counsel says." "Please do," I replied. "But while you're checking with your counsel, maybe ask them about your walking trail. You know, the one built 10 feet into my property." Her eyes flicked up fast. Confusion, then realization, then something like panic. I didn't press it. I just let the silence sit between us, heavy as a thundercloud. After a long pause, she turned to leave, snapping to her board members. "Let's go." They climbed back into the Lexus, doors slamming in sync. As they pulled away, I couldn't help but smile. Because in that moment I realized something powerful. They weren't untouchable. For years I'd thought HOAs ruled with absolute authority, but all it took was one person with a map and a little backbone to make them blink. I went back to my garden, the same one they'd tried to label illegal, and watered my tomatoes with a grin. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. The battle wasn't over, not even close, but I'd drawn my line in the dirt. Literally, and I was ready to defend it. After Cheryl and her board retreated in silence that morning, I knew I had to act, not just for myself, but for the principle of ownership and respect. The HOA had overstepped, plain and simple. They had taken 10 feet of my land, walked over it for years, and now tried to make me feel like a criminal for growing a few tomatoes. It was time to turn the tables. I spent the next few days gathering evidence like a detective preparing a case. Every inch of my property was documented. Photographs of the fence line, timestamps from trail cameras I'd installed months earlier, detailed maps showing exactly where HOA jurisdiction ended and where my land began. I even created a spreadsheet tracking every jogger, every trespassing instance, and how long they'd been on my turf. Once I had everything in order, I drafted a certified letter to the HOA. The language was firm but professional. I cited the trespass, the unauthorized use of private land, and included copies of all my evidence. I demanded one of 2 things. Either the HOA cease using the strip of land immediately, or they pay for its unauthorized use, $200 per day, totaling a sum that made even me do a double take. It wasn't about the money, really. It was about accountability. I sent it off and waited. That's when things started to happen fast. Within 48 hours, a neighbor leaked an internal HOA email chain to me. Apparently panic had set in. Cheryl had initially tried to draft a counterfine, accusing me of harassment, until the treasurer pointed out something important. If my calculations were correct, their insurance could be liable for the back rent and trespass claims. A collective panic must have rippled through the board because the tone of their communications shifted from confident to frantic. 2 days later, I received a heavy, lawyered-up letter from the HOA. Fancy seal, official letterhead, intimidating language, the whole package. They wanted to make me feel small, like I was a rogue element in a system designed to enforce compliance. But I didn't flinch. I read the letter from start to finish, then calmly drafted my response. I cited their own bylaws against them. Section 8, subsection B, the association shall not make improvements upon private property without written consent. I hadn't given consent, period. It was almost poetic. They had been policing a portion of my land they had no authority over, and now I was quoting the very rules they had used to try to control me. The community reaction began to shift almost immediately. Neighbors who had once nodded politely when Cheryl lectured about standards started whispering in the grocery store aisles. Some stopped by my garden under the guise of curiosity, peeking at the tomatoes, hens, and irrigation system. They didn't know the full story yet, but they sensed something. My small garden, my modest little plot, was becoming a symbol. Then came the big day, the vote. Cheryl had proposed an amendment to expand HOA jurisdiction over the rear buffer zone, which would have effectively erased my small victory. I went door to door, quietly showing neighbors the maps, the trail cam footage, and the letter documenting the HOA's trespasses. People were shocked. I didn't need to argue. The evidence spoke for itself. By the time voting day arrived, I had 10 families committed to supporting me. The clubhouse that night felt like a courtroom. Cheryl stood at the front, projecting authority, trying to convince the room that my farm, my hens, my irrigation system somehow diminished property values. I stayed quiet until my turn, then handed out an envelope with a single line of proof. Pictures of board members trespassing at midnight, flashlights and tape measures in hand. The room went silent. When the votes were counted, the amendment failed spectacularly. 21 against, 7 in favor. Cheryl's face went ghost white. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The silence, the clarity of justice served was enough. That afternoon, I filed the paperwork to officially turn my property into an educational farm. Suddenly, my little garden was not just legal. It was sanctioned, permitted, and protected. Kids could learn, neighbors could visit, and my tomatoes could grow in peace. Yet even in victory, a shadow lingered. Weeks later, reports surfaced that someone had been attempting to forge HOA and county documents, property adjustments, tax reassessments, boundary changes, all aimed at undermining my claim. At first, I didn't know what to think. Could Cheryl still be orchestrating something from afar, or was this a rogue developer trying to exploit the chaos? I worked closely with legal counsel to trace every forged signature, every false filing. The investigation revealed a network of falsified documents linked back to HOA accounts, showing just how far someone would go to control what didn't belong to them. Sitting in my office one evening, surrounded by maps and court notices, I thought about the strange journey of a simple garden. What had started as a hobby, a quiet attempt to connect with the land, had become a battleground. I realized something profound. Power isn't just about who rules or enforces rules. It's about who understands them, who knows how to navigate the system, and who has the courage to push back when it's being abused. I walked out to the garden, the setting sun casting long shadows across the raised beds. The hens clucked softly, pecking at the dirt as if nothing had changed, and for a moment the world felt right again. My battle wasn't about control anymore. It was about respect, community, and the invisible lines that connect us to the ground we stand on. Sometimes, I think about Cheryl, about how one person's obsession with order can spiral into something almost unrecognizable, something that threatens not just property but identity. And I smile, not out of schadenfreude, but because I understand something she never fully realized. The rules are not the enemy. Control is understanding them, using them wisely, that's true power. And in the quiet of my garden, surrounded by tomato vines and a few curious hens, I finally felt it. Victory, not in the money, not in the lettered fines, but in knowing that this little piece of earth was mine to grow, teach, and protect.